Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the invite, and thanks for printing out the slides. I overestimated the eyesight of the esteemed members of the committee. I'm going to focus, with my short time that I have.
Chairman, I wouldn't overemphasize that one. We can read and see as well.
You won't make the same mistake.
Don't worry.
I'm going to focus my remarks on, we were asked 3 questions. I'm going to focus on the first 2, just because of time, on the question of financial, budgetary and economic policy integration in the EU, and democratic accountability and legitimacy and political union. My contention is that there is a very profound change happening in the European Union at the moment. It's a change that is happening without enough discussion, without enough debate, without enough awareness about what's happening. And it is, as President Barroso said, it's a silent revolution. On the first slide there, a silent revolution in terms of stronger economic governance by small steps. The Member States have accepted, and I hope they understood it exactly, but they have accepted very important powers of the European institutions regarding surveillance and a much stricter control of the public finances. In my opinion, it's a revolution, or a counter-revolution, that is well underway, that has made significant strides already in the direction that it wants to go, but that there's a lot more and a further direction left to go. In my opinion, the model at which it's driving towards could be summed up with the phrase authoritarian neoliberalism. What do I mean by authoritarian neoliberalism? Effectively, you can sum it up in 3 aspects. 1, the technocratization of economic policy making, by which I mean economic policy is no longer a matter for political debate between left and right, between neoliberals, Keynesians, socialists, but instead there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer, and the right answer happens to be the answer favoured by the Thatcherites and the neoliberals. So that's like an ideological assault that takes place with the rising of economists to be high priests, etc., who simply can't be questioned. Secondly, flowing on from that, it makes the right policies, neoliberal policies, it makes them law. That's what we've seen so far. I'll go on to explain it. But it embeds neoliberalism in law in the European Union and in member states of the European Union, in national legislation. And at the same time, in the words of Martin Callanan, the leader of the British Conservatives in the European Parliament, it's making socialism illegal. In reality, it's making Keynesianism illegal. It's making significant state expenditure, running deficits, etc. It's making them illegal under the rules of the European Union and the process of economic governance. And then thirdly, it involves a significant transfer of power. And that's real. I don't think it's disputable. A transfer of power from elected governments to unelected bodies, in particular the European Commission and the European Central Bank. Why is it happening? Is it a response to the crisis, or is it taking advantage of the crisis? In my opinion, it's both. It's partly a response to the crisis within the framework that the political establishments across Europe know, which is a framework of neoliberalism. But it's also an example of what Naomi Klein calls the shock doctrine, whereby you use a shock, in this case clearly created by neoliberal capitalism, to go further in embedding those very policies. And that is what's happening at the moment. I have 2 quotes on that slide from the 2 biggest big business lobbying organisations in Europe, the European Roundtable of Industrialists and Business Europe. The ERT, European Roundtable of Industrialists, said, this is in 2002, said, at the drafting stage, the implications of national budgets and of major national fiscal policy measures should be reviewed at the level of the Union. Well, that's what's been agreed over the past 2 years. This is something that has been pushed by big business in Europe over an extended period of time. But given the opportunity of the crisis, they've been able to go ahead and push it and have it successfully implemented. And a quote from Business Europe from spring 2010, that the Eurogroup will have to assume greater responsibility in improving economic governance in the euro area and put greater emphasis on domestic and competitiveness imbalances, which have proved in most recent developments to be a major source of fiscal instability. Again, that's precisely what has been done through the 6-pack, through the 2-pack, through the fiscal treaty. They're the changes that are being implemented, and they were wished for in advance of the crisis. In terms of what's happened so far, I think you can refer to on the one hand, non-legislative measures, which is, it's a nice term for what's been happening, and the other hand, legislative measures. So in terms of non-legislative measures, what we've seen, and largely without a peep in terms of the establishment media or so on, we've had the removal of elected governments in Greece and in Italy, their replacement of government by bankers, for bankers, whose mandate does not come from the peoples of those countries, but rather comes from the markets. We've had European Central Bank ransom notes sent to, for example, Berlusconi on the 5th of August 2011, seeking a series of measures that had to be implemented, finishing with the ominous line, "We trust that the government will take all the appropriate actions," because Italians needed the ECB to buy the bonds on Monday morning. If they didn't, there'd be a collapse, but the bond prices would go through the roof, and so the ECB was this unelected, unaccountable institution, was holding the sword over the Italian government, which obviously I completely disagree with that Italian government. And we know the same. We don't know the details because we haven't seen the letters, but we know letters were sent to the Irish government at the end of 2010. And obviously the experience of Troika, so-called supervision, whereby the Troika dictates, yes, there's a certain discussion, but primarily dictates economic policies to the governments of Greece, governments of Portugal and governments of Ireland. They're the non-legislative measures we've seen so far, but also there's been a series of legislative measures. So three, really. The six-pack, which we only heard about in Ireland in the course of the fiscal treaty debate, but which had already happened at that stage, the fiscal treaty itself, and the two-pack, which will come before the European Parliament next week. I will oppose it, but I think it's overwhelmingly likely to be passed, unfortunately. And what they have done together, firstly, they've made the Stability and Growth Pact targets binding. So the 3% deficit, the 60% debt to GDP ratio, they've made them binding and subject to fines if countries don't meet those targets or be heading towards meeting those targets. They've imposed rules in national law of binding force and permanent character about a structural deficit, which is new, that wasn't in Stability and Growth Pact, of 0.5%, as well as the Stability and Growth Pact targets. It's introduced a procedure called the excessive deficit procedure, which 20 countries in the EU are currently in, which subjects them to a large degree of supervision by the European Commission in particular. The introduction of a system which hasn't been discussed at all called the scoreboard system, which is new. It's beyond stability and growth. It's 10 other indicators that the Commission now uses to monitor the economies of the EU countries. And if countries exceed their scoreboard targets, they can be put in what's called an excessive imbalance procedure, and again can be subject to fines if they don't implement the corrective measures, which are always Thatcherite, which are always neoliberal. They've changed the voting rules in the Council with breathtaking cynicism, whereby the qualified majority voting has been turned on its head, and now when you're voting on sanctions for countries, like fines if they haven't implemented sufficiently rigorous austerity in the view of the Commission, it's almost impossible to stop those fines being passed, because it's presumed to pass unless you can get a qualified majority against it. And also countries who are subject to fines, miscreant countries, lose their vote. They lose their vote on other subsequent votes that will take place about fining other countries. An attack on democracy at the level of the European Council and the introduction of the European semester. In terms of the two-pack, just to give an example of some of the details, because we just hear, oh, okay, the budget's going to take place in October now, that's all the difference is going to make, as if there's something completely innocuous about the two-pack. I have a couple of quotes. So a common budgetary timeline is introduced, and it's not just about everyone doing it at the same time. That's there for a purpose. It's for a purpose that the Commission can apply political pressure on governments to make sure that budgets are changed if necessary, to make sure enough austerity, in their view, is implemented. So the Commission now has the power to request a revised draft budgetary plan in accordance with the provision of this regulation. The introduction of economic partnership programmes, which detail in a detailed way the policy measures and structural reforms needed to ensure an effectively durable correction of the excessive deficit. That's an agreement really between the Member State and the European Commission. And enhanced surveillance, which again will put a number of countries, not just countries who are in so-called bailouts, but other countries, put them in the same position, whereby they're extensively subject to surveillance. I think there's a lot more to come, a lot more to come. The paper that Emer referred to, Towards a Genuine Economic and Monetary Union, everyone should read that if they haven't. There's different drafts of it. It's kind of different iterations as they go through discussions. People should read them all, because even the stuff that's come out of the latest drafts, it doesn't mean it's still not there in terms of the plan that the elites within Europe, Van Rompuy personally, but in particular Barroso, I'd say as well, have a mind to. Just some quotes to give you an indication. So the first quote: "The reforms introduced to the creation of the European semester are a step in the right direction, but there is a need to go further." This is the start, not the end of the process for them, and it ends for them in a political fiscal union with an absence of democracy, of real democracy, a real control by people over economic affairs, and with austerity institutionalised. A fully fledged integrated budgetary framework would require the establishment of a treasury function with clearly defined fiscal responsibilities. What they're talking about there is a European Minister of Finance, or at least a European Finance Ministry. That is the direction that they want to go with this process. And again, not necessarily subject to democratic check or accountability. I'll leave out the third quote. The fourth quote, which I think this is more where they're currently at, and what we're currently going to see is a real emphasis on arrangements of a contractual nature between Member States and EU institutions. They want to have contracts for austerity between the different Member States in Europe and the European Commission. And it's a way of subverting democracy, because the contracts won't bind the government, they'll bind the state. And so if a government is kicked out because people don't like austerity, people vote against austerity, in law at least, the contract will bind the government that then comes in. To finish, what's so bad about all of this? Does this not make sense? Is it not the only way to save the euro? Is it not the only way to save our economies? Firstly, I think it's fundamentally undemocratic. It's a fundamentally undemocratic process. It's taking power away from people to decide on economic policy. It's taking economic policy out of the sphere of political debate. But secondly, I think that institutionalised austerity, which is what this means deeper crisis. It's not going to solve the economic crisis. It is austerity that is being implemented across Europe. It is austerity that has resulted in 0.6% contraction in GDP in the last quarter of last year. Eurozone has gone back into recession. It's obviously caused, disaster for many, many people, 26 million people unemployed, and social devastation in Greece in particular. So you see the consequences for people. But why is this policy then being pursued? I would finish with the idea that austerity is working. It's working for those it's meant to work. Austerity was never envisaged as a plan to save the economy, improve people's lives, etc. It was envisaged as a plan by which the very rich, the 1% in our society, could strengthen their position at the expense of the rest of them. The bondholders have been protected. Profits are up pretty much right across the European Union. Privatisation is being pushed. Wages, generally speaking, have been pushed down. The result is that you have 750 billion euros in excess cash holdings in listed EU companies. So profits are going up. Investment by the private sector continues to decline, and the result is large amounts of cash sitting on the balance sheets of big business. In my opinion, the way out of this crisis is through public investment, is through socialist policies. But they are precisely the policies that are attempted to be outlawed through this whole process of authoritarian neoliberalism. Finally, what is to be done? Massive protest across Europe. To be honest, what we need, and I know people here probably won't agree with me, or most of them, but we need... the picture there is from the 14th of November in Spain, when you had a general strike in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, in Portugal, in Malta and in Cyprus. We need a European-wide struggle of working people against austerity and against this process of undemocratic process of authoritarian neoliberalism. Thanks a lot.